To The Rick Smith Show. For more information, go to thericksmithshow.com. If you've missed any portion of the program, you can download the podcast at thericksmithshow.com.
You're listening to WIN, Workers Independent News, a Diversified Media Enterprises production. I'm Doug Cunningham. Tired of working for Mickey Mouse low wages, 38,000 union Disney World workers began negotiations Monday for living wages. Wages are the only topic at the bargaining table. These Disney workers average about $10 an hour now, and the unions want a path to a $15 minimum wage. The unions got Disney to improve wages in the last contract, and these talks are a scheduled wage reopener to see further improvements toward a living wage. Ed Chambers is president of UFCW Local 1625 and also heads the Service Trades Council of 6 unions representing the approximately 38,000 workers.
Disney's first offer was not a bad offer. I mean, it came out suggesting 2% for the employees at the top at every level, and during the scale at 2.5%. Our proposal was pretty significant wage increase across the board. We asked for labor grades, which would mean every position would be in a labor grade, and there'd be a scale so that employees would come in at one rate. At 90 days, they would go to a rate. At 1 year, they'd be at one. At 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, and 5 years at a top out.
Chambers says Disney is bargaining in good faith. He says other employers in the hospitality tourist industry in Florida pretty much match Disney's pay scale, so more union density in Florida would help all workers get living wages.
Disney World, everybody else just matches, and it doesn't help the union situation. It doesn't help the overall economy. We need to get some more hotels and resorts and the hospitality industry covered by collective bargaining so we get a little competition, and then we can do the standards that we have in a lot of other places in the United States.
The small group of Target workers in Christiansburg, Virginia, ended their 5-day strike yesterday. They've returned to work without retaliation from Target. Their actions got Target to investigate a manager accused of sexual and racial harassment of workers. The workers are demanding the manager be fired. Adam is with the New River Workers Power, a small independent workers committee.
We've kind of already won in a way, and we're just going to keep up the pressure on them and make sure this guy gets kicked out, and we want to keep our jobs, and we want to build off of this and start talking to workers about next steps.
Bryn Farrell is a New River Workers Power member.
We're in a more rural area of southwest Virginia. There's nearby a university town, and the next town over is where this Target is. So there's a strong mix of red and blue. But the reality is labor is not a red or a blue issue, it's a community issue.
The news is brought to you by Impact, the Iron Worker Management Progressive Action Cooperative Trust. Impact's mission is more jobs for contractors and for iron worker members. You can become an iron worker in Washtenaw Community College's pre-apprenticeship program. Finish 24 credits at your own pace and become an Iron Worker Local 25 apprentice. Earn while you learn. Apply now at wccnet.edu.iron. That's wccnet.edu.iron. You've been listening to WIN, Workers Independent News. For more information, visit workersindependentnews.com.
It's time for the Rick Smith Show.
I want you to get up now. I want all of you to get up out of your chairs. I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, "I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!"
I don't want to abolish government. I simply want to reduce it to the size where I could drag it into the bathroom and drown in the bathtub.
You bet I cut the taxes at the top.
How dare you? How dare you? Go ahead, make my day.
The Rick Smith Show starts now.
This is the Rick Smith Show. Thanks so much for tuning in. Lots to get to, lots to talk about as the rain continues to fall. In fact, the governor of Texas saying we can't take any more rain. 14 are dead already. The tragic story of a family of 6 being swept away by floodwaters kind of dominated the news. We see all of this tragedy. We see all of this horrible, horrible tragedy. And what it's got me thinking about is how what we're seeing is sensationalized to a point, is propagandized to another. In fact, I saw this clip over at Fox News, and it's like there's an alternative reality going on over there where there's real human suffering, and they're still pushing an agenda. In fact, the one host of the Bill O'Reilly flack, Jesse Waters, joked that he saw a shark on the highway swimming in the water. Nobody has said that. There have been alligators because you're right there. There have been fish. There's stuff, but a shark? No. And then the joke was, oh, it's like a real life Sharknado. And you go, no, I'm not buying that. And this is another one of those moments where I look at what comes out of Fox News, and it's one of those things where you just cannot believe the words coming out of their mouth almost. It's like they live in a completely different world. And pushing the agenda. And again, we've seen the calls for privatization of the flood insurance program, which, again, the whole reason the federal government took it over is the insurance companies didn't want it. They couldn't figure it out. They couldn't fund it. It was something that they couldn't do because it wasn't profitable. And now we're back to those calls. But I look at this when disaster strikes. I look at when crisis hits. And I go back and I think of all of the bad policy pushed forth by Republicans. And look, I hate pointing the finger strictly at them. Sure, there are a lot of bad Democrats. But they're not really married to this free market fetish as much. And the Texas Tribune came out with an article yesterday. And it was one of those moments where you go, Republicans do a much better job of looking down the road and figuring out how to benefit business and harm individuals. For instance, House Bill 1774, which evidently is set to take effect Friday. What it does is under the guise of we need to crack down on frivolous lawsuits, because we've heard this nonsense come out of Republicans for a very long time, be it on health care. And understand, Texas is at the forefront of crushing frivolous lawsuits, especially with health care. And I love the arguments of, we need tort reform so we protect our doctors who just want to practice their love of women, to go back and quote George W. Bush. So what they did is they went, and on the tort reform front, is they basically, if you're injured through malpractice, you can only sue for a certain amount. And the argument was it will bring premiums down. And what actually happened was the premiums went up. Completely the opposite. But still, what you had is, the individual's getting screwed. So House Bill 1774 does almost the exact same thing. And people who are losing their homes, losing all of their possessions, losing their everything that they own because of this storm, better figure out by Friday how to put in a claim, because what's going to happen, if you don't get it in by Friday, this new law, which again was supposed to cut down on frivolous lawsuits, will allow insurance companies, the way this was written, to basically not pay, to delay payment for forever, to have, all kinds of the worst things that we saw during Hurricane Katrina, where we saw in Florida, where we saw in in Mississippi, some of the worst insurance industry schemes. Because, look, they don't want to pay. They want to collect premiums. They want to give you that warm, fuzzy feeling that you're insured, but they want no part. They want no part of paying out claims. Now, this law would basically undo all of the penalties that go with late payment. So if you were to file your claim by Friday, you would benefit from the higher penalty payments. And, maybe get the money a little bit sooner. But I go back to the way these folks look down the road. I want how smart they really are when it comes to business insurance, especially when it's money. Because this is, at the time they were pushing this through was, again, the people on the other side who were saying, no, we can't have this. They were saying, look, this is a massive money grab by the insurance industry. This is going to harm individuals who are in the worst moments of their lives, where insurance companies are supposed to be there to provide the safety net that people pay for. And you keep coming back to this moment where the policies coming out of the Republican Party seem to be very one-sided, on the side of big business against the side of all the rest of us. And it's this, and again, I go back to this fetish of the free market. And I can't tell you how many people, especially recently, since I've been talking about privatization a lot on the TV show, have come back and said, I want government doing nothing. I want government doing absolutely nothing. Everything should be in the hands of the free market. Everything should be in the hands of a profitable company, because if I don't like them, then I can walk away. But here's the other part of that. They constantly walk away from us. And as I've said a million times, I would rather have something like this insurance pool being handled by we the people, administered by folks who have to stand before us every 2, 4, or 6 years and say what they've done, as opposed to a for-profit corporation who's accountable to no one other than, their board of directors and a handful of really powerful shareholders. I mean, there's this illusion that these CEOs and these corporate titans care about all the shareholders. They don't. They don't care about you and your little pension fund or your little 401k or the handful of shares that you may have squirreled away for a rainy day. No, they don't care about that. They care about the huge institutional investors. That's who they're answerable to, not you and me. So this idea that, hey, we can democratize the free market. Nonsense. You're never going to have enough money and clout. Sorry, not going to happen. And I look at this stuff and I go, this idea that, the free market should take care of it. And then, I love this one. This is my other favorite. Well, let the churches and private charities take care of it. So what did we see the last couple of days coming out of Houston? We saw Houston's Lakewood Church, which used to be the Summit where the Houston Rockets used to play. We're talking about an auditorium, an arena that seats almost 17,000 people, with their doors closed. Now, in Lakewood Church's defense, they came out and said, we never really closed the doors. We never really shut things down. We just didn't encourage people to come by. And you go, what's the difference? And now these are the charities. These are the people who are supposed to, in these moments, this is the guy who, if the story that I read is correct, they were robbed of one of their Saturday collections, $660,000. That's what was in the buckets, because they don't have a plate. They got buckets for you to put your donations in. Almost a 17,000 seat arena. And yet there are no people there. There was no, hey, our parishioners are faithful. Come, be safe here. There was a little water in the parking lot. There was. But the arena was fine, where the people would have stayed perfectly fine. And this is, again, back to my problem. Free market doesn't work in times of crisis. It sounds beautiful when it's a sunny day. When the rain falls and the crisis hits, it's all about them and screw you. Same thing with the prosperity gospel folks who say, let the charities do it, let the churches do it. You know why the churches don't do it and have not done it? Is because they won't or can't. The only people who can take care of us in times of need is us. We, the people, collectively taking care of our own. Through our government, through our institutions, through the mechanisms at which we devise to make sure that people get cared for. And yet, every time I turn around, what I see coming out of Republican policymakers is how do we destroy that? How do we tear it down? How do we erect barriers? How do we put up higher goalposts for people to reach? And it's, every time one of these tragedies happens, I hope there's this epiphany. I hope people wake up and go, enough of this already. This is a failure. That's my hope. I'm going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk with our good friend Chris Stroop. Stick around. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show. We're working people. Come to talk.
Disorder in the house. There's a flaw in the system. And the fly in the ointment storm bring the whole thing down. Floodgates are open. We've let the demons loose. The big guns have spoken. And we've fallen for the ruse.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1907. That was the day that became known for the Quebec Bridge disaster in Canada. Workers were building a cantilever bridge over the St. Lawrence River. This was not an easy task. The river was 2 miles wide at its narrowest point. The river was deep, moved quickly, and was icy in the winter. But in the late 1880s, businessmen in Quebec who wanted to keep up trade with Montreal decided the river had to be spanned. The project did not begin for more than a decade due to a lack of funds. Finally, the Canadian government supported the project to improve the nation's railway infrastructure. Theodore Cooper, a respected American bridge designer, was signed on for the project. Despite concerns about the bridge's design, he never visited the site due to illness. 86 men were working on the project that fateful day. Their workday was drawing to a close when the bridge suddenly collapsed. 75 men plunged to their deaths. Some of their bodies were never found. The bridge collapsed because of design flaws. The official report of the disaster noted that the loss of life, quote, might have been prevented by the exercise of better judgment on the part of those in responsible charge of the work for the Quebec Bridge and Railway Company and the Phoenix Bridge Company. Unfortunately, it was not the last tragedy trying to cross the St. Lawrence. After the bridge collapsed, the Canadian government took over the project. A partial collapse on that effort killed 13 more workers in 1916. The bridge finally opened in 1917. Its completion came at a high price, costing $22 million and 86 lives. Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show. For more information, go to laborhistoryin2.com.
The man who sends the investor class diving for their tax shelters. Rick Smith.
The rich pay too much taxes, the poor get way too much. Instead of schools, build prisons and lock the children up. We won't believe those lies again, because God is a Republican.
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Check out the website, thericksmithshow.com. So a story yesterday at CNN caught my attention. It's another one of these moments where you look at these incestuous ties, this pool between right-wing extremism and extreme religiosity. And the CNN reports that a West Virginia man who was a former contractor in Iraq proposed setting up a meeting with Russians and the Trump campaign last year to discuss their, quote, shared Christian values, raising new questions for investigators to explore as part of their Russia inquiry. And it turns out, and look, I've often wondered. You see at 3 o'clock in the morning, Pat Boone out there saying, hey, we need to get a whole bunch of money so we can get the Russian Jews back. And you go, explain. And you look at these networks that are being built in the name of Christianity. And it's scary stuff. And here to talk a little bit, share his thoughts, is Christopher Stroop. He is, in my view, one of the experts on this topic, a writer, ex-evangelical, and a PhD in modern Russian history. Chris, thanks for taking time for us.
Thanks for having me back on, Rick. It's always great to be on your show.
So am I right to be kind of freaked out when I see this statement that there was a proposed meeting to discuss the shared Christian values between the Russians and the Trump campaign?
Sure. I think that's definitely concerning. Even though in this case the meeting didn't happen, we do know that there are these massive right-wing networks, a lot of connections, a lot of ties, and that Russia under Putin has rebranded itself as the standard bearer for traditional values in the world. And a lot of our right-wing Christian conservatives have rallied around Putin. Brian Fisher of the American Family Association, for example, has called him a lion of Christianity. And the other day, I think it was August 20th, he tweeted that the FBI is more likely guilty of collusion with Russia than Trump, which is just kind of hilarious, So these guys who praise Russia engage in a lot of deflection, and they propagate the Kremlin's talking points on social media and elsewhere.
Now, just to highlight this, maybe I'm wrong, but Putin was a high KGB official, right?
No, you're right. He was an important KGB official.
And somehow that, and what we know the KGB has done, somehow those are Christian values?
Well, I'll tell you what I think Putin values besides wealth and power, and I think that is Russian greatness. I think that while his understanding of patriotism is toxic and hyper-masculine, I think he is a Russian patriot. And interestingly enough, in the late Soviet years, there were not many true believers, not many true Leninists left. There was an increasing ideological vacuum. And among Soviet dissidents at that time, it started to be filled with Christianity. There were a lot of Russian religious philosophers, intellectuals, people that I've studied, who were being passed around in samizdat, which of course was the underground self-printed literature that dissidents spread in the Soviet Union. And so once the Soviet Union actually fell apart, the church became much more powerful again, closer to the state. That's really come to a head. It's sort of increased in Putin's third term, in as much as he has cozied up even more to the church. But even in Soviet times, the church, such as it was allowed to exist, and it was treated much better from the time of World War II, when Stalin made a rapprochement with the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, in exchange for it praying for Soviet victory against the Nazis. The church's top clerics who have participated in international bodies, like the World Council of Churches, were also working for the KGB, reporting to the KGB or KGB agents themselves. And that's true of the former Patriarch Alexei, that's true of Patriarch Kirill. So there's this bizarre, cynical background that we're looking at. And now, as Putinism is trying to define itself as an ideology to replace Soviet Marxism, what you sort of have is this neo-imperial religious ideal. That's the kind of image that Putin is projecting of himself as a defender of traditional values, and many people on our right are eating it up.
I got to be honest, I had never thought in my lifetime that I would see someone in this country side with a Russian leader over many in our own country, but yet we're in this really bizarre moment, aren't we?
We are, and it's very telling of what the Christian right really has always been. Because during the Cold War, what allowed them to come into the mainstream was their anti-communism. And I think we all kind of tended to assume that people who are opposed to communism are for freedom. Turns out that's not actually the case, and really we could have known this all along if we'd been paying attention. If you look at the kinds of people who were lionized by hardline right-wingers, conservatives, including Christian conservatives during the Cold War, people like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who for his exposure of the gulags, of course, that was a heroic thing that we should admire, but Solzhenitsyn never made a secret of the fact that he was quite reactionary in his political views. He talked a lot about the decline of the West, and though he was expelled from the Soviet Union, after the Soviet Union collapsed and as Putin consolidated power, he received Russian citizenship again. He moved back to Russia. He died a Putin supporter. So it's not authoritarianism that our Christian right has been opposed to. It's godlessness as they see it. And that's why they actually see secular democracy of the type that we have attempted to build when we're being our best selves here in America. They see it as godless and essentially as equivalent to the Soviet Union, whereas they look to someone like Putin enforcing religious ideals, particularly with his persecution of the LGBTQ community and projecting this hyper-masculine image, and they say, great, we can sign up for that. We can sign up for Christian authoritarianism.
Which would kind of give a rationale for how Trump rose to power, even with all of his flaws, grab her by the you-know-what and all of the womanizing and the multiple divorces and all of the, well, I would argue anti-Christian behavior. It's how that must be how they're able to put all of that aside then.
Yeah, absolutely, because Trump is doing what they want. He's pursuing their agenda. He stole one Supreme Court seat for them. I mean, well, I guess you could say Mitch McConnell helped a lot. The Republicans in general are responsible for that, but Trump filled it with somebody who is clearly going to rule against Roe v. Wade if it comes up, presumably to overturn Obergefell as well. So, yeah, he is listening to the Christian right. They either explain away his bad behavior with, well, he's maybe Christian, or they say, well, we understand very well he's not one of us and he's flawed, but God raised him up anyway to pursue our agenda, Yeah,
and that frame that you just said there, and real quick, I can't tell you how many different emails I got from these chains of saying that same kind of rhetoric. He's not perfect. He's flawed. He's not really one of us, but God sent him and he will do our work. And that's why we need to support him. And I remember reading this stuff going, really? Is this how modern day Christianity now works? And the answer, I guess, is sadly, yes.
I mean, it's, of course, hashtag not all Christians, right? But certainly the Christian right has a lot of power. It's a dangerous anti-democratic force. And I don't think we can dismiss it as fake Christianity. I don't think that's helpful. Because if you want to look into the history of Christianity, it's sets of beliefs, norms, practices, different kinds of Christian communities, the texts themselves, the Bible, as well as theological writings. There are a lot of resources in this complex Christian discourse that can support social justice, but there are also a lot of resources in this Christian discourse and in Christian history that can support authoritarianism and Christian imperialism. So it's a complex legacy. Could use a term that was coined by the anthropologist Clifford Geertz. A religion is a cultural system. And, there are always going to be internal fissures in any kind of cultural system, and there's going to be contention about what true Christianity is. If we're looking at it from the outside as a kind of scholarly observer, we can't adjudicate between competing versions of what Christianity is as long as they do show this record of practice, norms, beliefs in relation to the scripture, in relation to the tradition. So Trump himself, I'd call a fake Christian, because he's obviously faking piety to the extent that he does. But the Christians who support him, they are Christians. Christianity has to own its shadow side. Yeah, and now that shadow side is ascendant.
Yeah, I mean, I've always said that, once we finally stick the flag in the ground, say we're a Christian nation, That's when the real fun begins, as all of these extreme sects begin to eat each other simply so that they can be the dominant Christian sect in a Christian nation.
Well, you know, what has worked so well for them so far, and I guess we can question how well it would continue, but I don't see them necessarily eating each other because it is working, is to form increasingly broad conservative religious coalitions. So, I can remember, for example, when I was growing up, the evangelicals that I grew up with, sure, they were misogynist. They would claim they were not racist, but would not act on that at all. And so actually were racist, would support racist policies anyway. On an individual level, they would strive not to be, but, racism is systemic. They were homophobic, but they drew a line at the prosperity gospel. They were very suspicious of Catholics. They were very suspicious of Mormons. All that changed. You now have all these conservative churches working together to pursue common goals in what I like to call bad ecumenism. It's interfaith action for the purpose of domination rather than for the purpose of the common good.
Yeah, and I was going to ask about that because we've seen these networks and I remember back, and I think it was Justice Alito that they were trying to confirm, and you had these Justice Sunday events where thousands of churches were linked up with the satellites, and they were organizing all of these different congregations to get out in the streets and to really push for Alito. I'm pretty sure it was Alito. It was either Alito or Roberts, but to push to get them confirmed. And I think it was Alito, and it was one of those moments for me to go, wow, they're creating their own little army.
Yeah, I've been floating this hashtag lately on Twitter, Generation Culture Wars, because we used that very militant rhetoric growing up. People who grew up socialized in Christian school and churches, and that was really pretty much the extent of our social world, or in some cases homeschooled for Christian ideological reasons. We were mobilized to fight these culture wars, to try to take back America for Christ. And so, I was bused to the Life Chain anti-abortion protest from my church at that time in Indianapolis in 1991 when I was 11. My Christian high school used to take juniors and seniors on field trips to hardline Christian right political conventions hosted by a little organization that was then called Citizens Concerned for the Constitution, but it has since rebranded as Advance America. And if you Google Advance America Indiana, you can find its website, and it bills itself as Indiana's premier organization in support of homeschooling, Christian schools, and the family, which are all big code words for theocracy. That was not the kinds of political activities that we were involved with through our Christian school. They were far from neutral civics lessons, far from just trying to instill in us the ideal that living in a democratic society, you should participate in political processes. It was, no, your religious faith dictates that you participate in political processes precisely this way, ultimately to subvert democracy.
And what's interesting is, being from Indiana, we have a vice president who is a state representative and governor of the state of Indiana who pushes those exact policies. And I often say, while Trump is bad, I think long term Pence could be much worse because of that theocratic mindset.
I agree. Pence, he has this, sort of milquetoast, maybe slightly charming, who's your good old boy demeanor. So many people might think that he's sort of harmless. He certainly manages to come across, when you listen to him speak, as more reasonable, unless you start to pay attention to the content of the things that he says to certain audiences. But he is a very effective culture warrior. He's much more competent than Trump. He knows how to play the game. He knows the networks. So if he does become president because Trump is impeached and removed from office or resigns, I think we are in serious danger because he would work towards these goals in a smoother, slyer way rather than Trump just sort of bumbling around with his bombast and incompetence.
Yeah, because look, I think and I don't know if Trump did this knowingly or if it was him just being guided by people like Pence, but I look at Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education, being that next pin in getting many of the culture war kind of curriculum not just funded but pushed into the mainstream.
Right. And of course, vouchers and school choice programs have always been about that. I mean, I suppose there are some people who support them on libertarian grounds, but the paradox of libertarianism is that you end up with authoritarianism of a different kind, And many people quite explicitly have been pushing for these policies in order to advance Christian schooling. The most thoroughgoing Christian Reconstructionists, the people who really understand that ideology and themselves identify with that ideology, would like to eliminate public schools altogether. Generally, they see homeschooling as the ideal because in their understanding of God's plan for the world, many of them think that education belongs to the family, maybe to some extent to the church, maybe the jurisdiction is tied between them, but it doesn't belong to the civil government in their view.
And to me, that kind of division, those kind of splits destroy this country. When you no longer have a set of mutually shared values and thoughts about democracy, and you've got chaos, I think.
Right. Well, they'd like to enforce their set of values on everyone, but we saw how well that worked in the Soviet Union with Marxism.
Good point. Let me ask you the other side of this, because what we're seeing in Texas right now is horrible tragedy. And you see these storms getting much worse. And I know several of these, what I would characterize as extreme evangelical types who are absolute climate deniers, and that they believe that these storms are getting worse. And I hate to make it sound ludicrous, but they believe that this is God punishing us for all of those bad things, and that if we were to do away with gay marriage and we would persecute the gays and we would do all of the horrible things that we know that they want to do, all of these things would stop, and that we have no involvement in the climate getting warmer. It's just an angry God.
Sure, it's all under God's control. Which is the ultimate cop-out for perpetuating the status quo. When I've talked to evangelicals in my own family, friends, relatives who voted for Trump, and they want to get off the hook for any kind of culpability in any of the horrible things that he's doing, they'll simply say, well, I had to vote for him because of abortion, and God is in control. So no responsibility. And yes, climate change denial is the most common position among evangelicals. It's also extremely dangerous, not just for America, of course, but for the entire planet. And they have made a lot of these statements about the weather perhaps being signs of divine punishment or impending apocalypse. You don't see that much rhetoric around Hurricane Harvey specifically, and I think that's because it's hitting Texas. If it were hitting a place that was perceived by them as more godless, yeah. Exactly. That's the comparison point. Really interesting thing happened yesterday on Twitter. I don't know if you noticed, but a lot of people started yelling at Joel Osteen.
As they should have.
Yes, not opening up his megachurch for victims of the flooding. And he, of course, was also raising money through his organization, supposedly to benefit the relief efforts. But, this is a man whose net worth is, I think it's supposed to be around $50 million. Why didn't he just give a substantial chunk of his own money instead of trying to raise more? So I coined this hashtag the other day, Empty the Pews, on Twitter, and it's really been taking off and going viral. And last night, the first thing that would come up, I think it may still be the case this morning, too, when you search for that hashtag on Twitter, is Joel Osteen, because everyone was tweeting it at him, which I thought was pretty wonderful.
No, it is wonderful. But here's the thing for me, and where I opened up the show with is, we keep hearing the evangelicals, the Christian type saying, we don't need government. Let the churches do it. Well, here's a moment where the church could have done it. You're talking about an almost 17,000 seat arena that is a church. You couldn't allow a handful of people from the community in. And this is, again, as I said, this was an opportunity for the church to step forward and actually do what the evangelicals have told me that they want to do, and they didn't.
Yeah, that's a great point, Rick. And it really is funny because when I was growing up again, this was hard right-wing authoritarian evangelicalism, but I heard from the pulpit, God is not Santa Claus. The churches that I grew up in were anti-prosperity gospel. So again, it's an example of how these coalitions have expanded, I think. And now evangelicals who don't themselves subscribe to the prosperity gospel are not going to criticize Joel Osteen or Paula White. Apparently, prosperity gospel charlatans are fine now, even for the people who used to criticize them before. It's all about coming together to assert power and dominance over the rest of America.
Let me ask you this last kind of line of questioning, because look, I know a lot of people who they're Christians. They go to church. They believe they believe in leading a good life. Following the Ten Commandments, the Golden Rule, all of that stuff. Mm-hmm. And yet I don't think they would identify with this. I mean, we're talking about not the majority of Christianity, but a very well-funded, powerful, small segment. No.
Sure, that's right. I mean, I wouldn't call it small, but it is a minority. So if you just want to try to come to a figure from the data that we have, white evangelicals are about 25% of the population. We know that 81% of that group that voted for Donald Trump. Donald Trump's approval rating among them is still at 65%, and that's down from 78% in April. But even the ones who now are saying they don't approve, for the most part, are not doing anything about it. So, say that's about 80% of that 25%. And then you add in the radical traditionalist Catholics, and you add in most of the Mormons. And so I think you come up with a figure somewhere around 25 to 30% of the U.S. population does consist of these radical right-wing Christians. But you also have a much larger percentage of the American population that is opposed to it, and that includes a very large percentage of Christians. So, of course, we do want to recognize that. And as I said with the Empty the Pews campaign, it's not anti-religious. It's a call to follow conscience. If you're sitting in a church that supports Trump and authoritarianism and toxic ideology, and you're wavering, I hope that if people came together, shared their stories of how they left those kinds of churches, other people might join, that it might embolden people to take a moral stand. So it's a call to leave your toxic church for either another church that is not toxic or no church at all, as your conscience dictates.
I got to tell you, scary, scary stuff, Chris. And as this continues, we'd love to have you come back and keep us informed of just how crazy things are getting.
Sure. I'm always happy to be on the show, Rick. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Chris Stroop. Again, you want to check out his website. Fantastic stuff there, chrisstroop.com. We'll get a link at thericksmithshow.com of how you can get in touch there. Really, I mean, just amazing and scary stuff to me. Quick break, right back. 1-888-520-RICK, 1-888-520-7425. This is The Rick Smith Show.
This is Solidarity News on Radio Labour.
This is a Radio Labour special report. I'm Mark Boulanger. The IUF, the global union which represents food, farm, hotel, and restaurant workers, is holding its International Congress this week. The Congress will run from Tuesday, August 29th to Thursday, August 31st. As is the usual practice with international labor conferences, a number of preliminary sessions on particular issues are being held. I talked to the chairs of two of these sessions. Sarah Meyer is an IUF international officer specializing in issues related to young people. I asked her what issues were raised by the participants in the IUF Youth Workshop.
What we did during the beginning part of the conference was talk about the common issues that young workers are facing internationally. And these predominantly include young worker unemployment or underemployment, what we refer to as a skills mismatch, which means that the supply and demand for certain skills isn't matching up in young worker populations, and also a general lack of quality jobs or work for young workers. So we're seeing a lot of part-time work, temporary contracts, precarious work, and also the impact of austerity regimes, particularly in Europe, and how this has impacted young workers.
What is the IUF doing to serve the needs of young workers?
This conference was really a first step to pull together young workers from all of our regions and to start talking about what issues we're facing. So what was endorsed today by the conference is the creation of a young worker committee, a flexible one in structure and one that will have continuity between the Congresses in terms of its composition and its members. And this committee will be tackling these issues moving forward. This is, as I said, a first step, and the ideas, after all, will come from the affiliates. So we need to get to work and start talking.
Are there any IUF activities and campaigns young people should be paying particular attention to?
Some of the research that we did leading up to this meeting showed that young worker populations are particularly concentrated in our hotel and restaurant sector, and also in agriculture. You might have heard about the fast food campaign going on, and I suspect that, well, not suspect, I know that a lot of the young workers who are here today are involved in that.
Another session chairperson I talked to at the IUF Congress was Michelle Kessler of the United Food and Commercial Union in the U.S. and Canada, the UFCW. Ms. Kessler chaired the session on the rights of LGBTQ workers. I asked her what issues the participants in the LGBTQ session focused on.
An injury to one is an injury to all. Making sure that, workers aren't harassed at the workplace, that discrimination issues are addressed in union contracts, that workers feel they can be themselves at their workplace with no fear of reprisal. And certainly the union should be who's enforcing those rights, not only at the workplace, but also extending that into the communities. We need to build a more equal world, and being inclusive in our unions is a key part of that.
What has your union, the UFCW, been doing to help LGBTQ workers?
We've been focusing on improving our union contracts, letting workers across all workplaces, whether it's on the plant floor, in grocery stores, elsewhere, know that the UFCW is strong on LGBTQ issues. And also, we've been spending a lot of time working on transgender issues, making sure we improve our health plans to include transgender health care.
Why is the UFCW dedicated to working with a global union such as the IUF?
Well, unfortunately or fortunately, depending how you look at it, we have become a global economy, right? And you can't assume that you can fix this in one part of the world and not fix it in the rest of the world. So we think, this is a great way for us to support each other and actually enhance our positions at the bargaining table. If it's not just happening in North America, it's happening in Europe, it's happening in Africa. I think that's key to our success.
And that's it. International labor news you can use. Radio Labor will be reporting directly from the IUF Congress throughout the week. I'm Mark Boulanger. Thank you for listening. And remember, it's all about global solidarity.
Minimum wage! Yeah! You know what it means when they pay you minimum wage? You know what they're trying to tell you is like, hey, if I could pay you less, I would.
So it looks like, again, the state of Missouri, like many states across the country, here in Pennsylvania being one of them, that the state of Missouri has taken the right of local municipalities and political subdivisions to increase their minimum wage. Thousands of workers in St. Louis now are going to see smaller paychecks because evidently starting on Monday, when the new Missouri law took effect, it's going to be interesting to see if they roll that back. An estimated 35,000 workers saw their wages increased in St. Louis to $10 an hour. Now, the Missouri Supreme Court ruled the state's Republican-led legislature passed the law requiring the state's uniform minimum wage. The state minimum wage is $7.70 per hour. Now, will they see those cuts? I think you will. I think a lot of employers will pull back on that, and you'll see a huge cut. And Kansas City being the other city that we'll see cuts as well because they passed it as well. But here again, you go back to these, and I can't get the thought of Christianity and having grown up I consider myself now a broken Catholic, but having grown up, in the Catholic Church as a kid, where they preached peace and social justice, and they preached the idea of community, and then somehow got really crazy. The church, the Catholic Church, really went, anti-abortion, and then money grubbing. Although they were money grubbing when I was a kid too. When I was one of the an aside, one of the things that really infuriated me as a kid. We grew up in a housing project, and there were days at the end of the month where there was nothing in the house to eat whatsoever. There was nothing. There weren't even condiments. And I remember on Mondays the church calling and saying, "Hey, how come there's no money in the envelope?" And my mother having to explain that there's no money in the envelope because there's no food in the cabinets. And I remember thinking that, that was just kind of cold and callous because, I went to Catholic school as a young kid. And, you had to turn in these envelopes as attendance to church. So you had to turn in something. And it had to have your name on it, and it had to be, it was a way of tracking you to make sure you were going to church, and which isn't a bad thing, I guess. But they wanted the money. Now, one could argue, and I had someone say to me, well, they maybe were just checking up to make sure that you didn't take it. And I'm going, no, after like the 20th week in a row, I think they would get kind of the thought. And then you add that to the fact that, our parish being the poorest in the diocese in Cleveland was the Swinging Door Parish. So every priest that had a problem in other places came through ours. In fact, at one point, I remember there being like 10 priests in our parish, and all of them at some point of deviance being shuffled onto somewhere else. And now we're seeing all those stories coming out, and I don't want to rehash all of that. But I remember as a kid being taught, by these these priests and by the nuns, and that you follow the teachings of Christ. You help others. You feed the hungry. You help the poor. You take care of the sick. You clothe the naked. You do all of those because it's the right thing to do. And that this idea of extreme wealth was kind of, a negative. I remember, the chances of a rich guy getting into heaven are like a camel getting through the eye of a needle. Not going to happen. And somehow in my lifetime, that's completely turned around to where greed is good. And I go back to the Reagan years and the rise of this Christian right. To where, as Chris points out, it is about authoritarian rule. It's about their dominance and following their beliefs, which is why, you see all of this homeschooling going on. I actually had a guy who, to be honest, I wouldn't want him leading a trip to the zoo, let alone teaching the next generation, because his view was his kid didn't need any books. All he needed was the Bible. Tote him and quote him was his little phrase. And I said, okay, well, let me see the book. Show me where it teaches you 2 + 2. I'm not against, you're reading the book. God bless you. Do what you got to do. But there's so much more to an education than just your narrow ideological view. And, I remember watching the movie Jesus Camp, which if you haven't seen and you want to be frightened and you need a good nightmare, watch that. Watch 6, 7, 8-year-old children sobbing uncontrollably because God is angry at them. And this is the world that some, and Chris, I got to be honest, scares me. Because when he's saying upwards of 30% of us, 30% are these far out, evangelical, extreme, they're almost to the point where it's not extreme anymore. They're becoming the mainstream. And what does that mean for policy? What does that mean for the Constitution? Because as he points out, it's not about governance. It's not about social democracy. It's about authoritarianism. It's about Christian Sharia law. And, you know, over the last year, I've been taking guff for that because I've said it. Look, if Pence becomes president, we will be down the road towards Christian Sharia law. There's no question in my mind. All of that horrible stuff that the right complains about those Muslims, coming right here. And, you know, some, well, we're going to undo, you know, Roe versus Wade. No, we're not going to just undo Roe versus Wade. They're going to undo Griswold. The right to contraception, done. And we're going to start locking people up in the scary world, the scary future that a Pence presidency, I believe, would bring us. Because for so long, this religious influence, for so long, this extreme moneyed religious influence. I mean, look at the rise of Liberty University. Look at the rise of these ideological evangelical schools. And if you really, I mean, honestly, it's always blown my mind that Donald Trump gets to speak there. Because you go, wait a second, wait for it. It's kind of crazy. But when you put it into the perspective that Chris points out, that he's the useful idiot, they need him to get to the next level, they need him to get to the next step, it makes perfect sense. And I remember talking about, you know, chain emails that I got during the campaign, justifying why Christians should vote for Donald J. Trump. And I remember just scratching my head going, wow. People are going to read this and go, yep, he's our guy. And that's what happened. And you look at the Betsy DeVosses, who are now part of his cabinet. You look at the Eric Prince, her brother, who was the former head of Blackwater, and I forget what they've changed it to now. I think Academy, I think it is now, which is now the combining of, well, Blackwater and she were also the combining of military and religion. But now you've got a religious mercenary group with access to education funding. Doesn't that not scare you just a little bit? Because it freaks me out. And when I asked Chris, you know, do Christians look at Putin, who is the head of the KGB, you know, sideways? Because look, I mean, he's, as head of the KGB, you're doing some pretty unchristian things. You know, I'm sure that a lot of those 10 commandments that they want splattered all over the place, I'm sure he broke a bunch of those. And not just the, you know, the honor thy father and mother and the go to church and don't use the Lord's vain name and no icons and well, I mean, the icons probably. But the murder and the steal, I'm sure a lot of that was going on. And they bear false witnesses and all that other stuff. The lying, the cheating, the stealing, I'm sure lots of that was going on. But as he pointed out, look, it's not about none of that. It's about the authoritarian strongman. And you have to ask yourself, is this the kind of country we want? Is this what we want for our children? Is this the kind of future where you go to church in a place like the Lakewood Church, an arena of almost 17,000, who when tragedy hits, they lock the door? I mean, I'm never shocked. I'm never surprised. Sometimes I'm disappointed. But when I look at the Osteens, and who I always thought has been a charlatan all along, when I look at this, I'm not surprised. What I am kind of surprised about a little bit, though, is that we're waking up. That the outrage I saw on Twitter all last night was real and was there. Now, if we can only get those free market fetishists to understand that our tax dollars fund that giggling idiot, and that we're funding our demise through these evangelical extreme groups, maybe we got a shot. Because I've often said, you know what, you want to give to your church? God bless you. I don't think it should be subsidized. I don't think it should be something that ends up being a tax deduction at the end of the year. You want to give? Give. but it should not be subsidized. To me, that simple. I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk with Andrea Chalupa. Trump Tower Moscow? Was it possible? We'll find out. Right back. Stick around.
Radio of, for, and by we the working people. The Rick Smith Show.
You're listening to The Rick Smith Show. For more information, go to thericksmithshow.com. If you've missed any portion of the program, you can download the podcast at thericksmithshow.com.
You're listening to WIN, Workers Independent News, a diversified media enterprises production. I'm Doug Cunningham. Tired of working for Mickey Mouse low wages, 38,000 union Disney World workers began negotiations Monday for living wages. Wages are the only topic at the bargaining table. These Disney workers average about $10 an hour now, and the unions want a path to a $15 minimum wage. The unions got Disney to improve wages in the last contract, and these talks are a scheduled wage reopener to see further improvements toward a living wage. Ed Chambers is president of UFCW Local 1625 and also heads the Service Trades Council of 6 unions representing the approximately 38,000 workers.
Disney's first offer was not a bad offer. I mean, they came out suggesting 2% for the employees at the top at every level, and during the scale at 2.5%. Our proposal was pretty significant wage increase across the board. We asked for labor grades, which would mean every position would be in a labor grade, and there'd be a scale so that employees would come in at one rate. At 90 days, they would go to a rate. At 1 year, they'd be at one. At 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, and 5 years at a top out.
Chambers says Disney is bargaining in good faith. He says other employers in the hospitality tourist industry in Florida pretty much match Disney's pay scale, so more union density in Florida would help all workers get living wages.
Disney World, everybody else just matches, and it doesn't help the union situation. It doesn't help the overall economy. We need to get some more hotels and resorts and the hospitality industry covered by collective bargaining so we get a little competition, and then we can do the standards that we have in a lot of other places in the United States.
The small group of Target workers in Christiansburg, Virginia, ended their 5-day strike yesterday. They've returned to work without retaliation from Target. Their actions got Target to investigate a manager accused of sexual and racial harassment of workers. The workers are demanding the manager be fired. Adam is with the New River Workers Power, a small independent workers committee.
We've kind of already won in a way, and we're just going to keep up the pressure on them and make sure this guy gets kicked out, and we want to keep our jobs, and we want to build off of this and start talking to workers about next steps.
Bryn Farrell is a New River Workers Power member.
We're in a more rural area of Southwest Virginia. There's nearby a university town, and the next town over is where this Target is. So there's a strong mix of red and blue. But the reality is labor is not a red or a blue issue, it's a community issue.
The news is brought to you by Impact, the Iron Worker Management Progressive Action Cooperative Trust. Impact's mission is more jobs for contractors and for iron worker members. You can become an iron worker in Washtenaw Community College's pre-apprenticeship program. Finish 24 credits at your own pace and become an Iron Worker Local 25 apprentice. Earn while you learn. Apply now at wccnet.edu.iron. That's wccnet.edu.iron. You've been listening to WIN, Workers Independent News. For more information, visit workersindependentnews.com.
Your proud defender of the working class majority, Rick Smith.
Welcome back to The Rick Smith Show. Check out the website, thericksmithshow.com. Questions, comments, something on your mind, you can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. So much for the adamant denials of dealings with Russia. Remember that? I mean, there was a whole bunch of, I have nothing to do, I do nothing, I have nothing. Turns out that the Trump attorney, Michael Cohen, reached out to the Kremlin to pursue the big tower. They wanted a Trump Tower Moscow. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, that, again, the president's denial in all this. And as I said from the beginning, had he simply came out, and I tell, this again, what I tell my kids, be honest. Because once you start having to remember all of the lies, you get caught up. You do. Which is why I don't lie. I remember as a kid, I would tell my grandmother everything. Now, she wouldn't believe me, but I would tell the truth. So that when eventually someone would come, oh, do you know what he did? Oh, he did tell me that. I told the truth. As outlandish and as crazy as it may sound, always tell the truth. Because, and again, I tell the kids this, if you tell me the truth and it's bad, I won't be as angry as I would have been had I found out and you lied to me. And I think we, the people, are kind of the same way. Had the president come out and said, you know what? I had some dealings in Russia. I tried to build a tower. Like any business, we're trying to expand everywhere. I think the mass of people would have said, okay, it is what it is. And I look at it, and the more these denials happen, the more the insanity happens, the more the craziness goes on, the deeper this gets. And you look at the fact that there are all of these voices popping out and all of this stuff popping up with, again, all roads seem to lead right back to Russia. And you go, how's that possible? How is it possible that all of this seems, if there's nothing there and he did nothing wrong and he's adamantly opposed to good, how is it possible he didn't know? Is it one, he's incompetent? Or is it two, he's lying? And I got to be honest, either one, I don't think I want leading our country. I'm sorry, I just want no part of it. I mean, it is that simple. And, now you're starting to see people who, for a while have not been the voices of impeachment. Now, Lawfare, a very well-respected website, on legal issues, foreign policy, they came out with an op-ed yesterday saying, it's time. It's time for Congress to open up formal impeachment inquiries. And on a number of bases, they point out, the three things. One, being that he abused his power, most obviously with trying to cover up all of this stuff around Russia. I mean, it's really kind of bizarre. And I go back to, had he just come out and said from the beginning, there was some stuff that went on. We don't know what it was. We weren't involved, but we're going to get to the bottom of it. That was a simple press release. That was a simple statement that, honestly and truthfully, most of us would have bought. Lawfare goes on to say that the other part of it is he should be impeached for his failures of moral leadership and also his abandonment of basic duties in office. Now, again, this is one of these, well-respected blogs that has finally come out and said, look, things are off the rails. Now, as I've said, I'm not an impeachment fan. I'm not on the impeachment bandwagon because I think the next guy to take over is that much worse. And I've said that 1,000 times. What I think we need to do is we need to take back Congress. We need to take back at least one of the branches of government to stop the insanity. And maybe, and this is, me being the eternal optimist, maybe by having that division, you get Trump, who fancies himself a wheeler and a dealer, willing to reach across the aisle to Democrats and some sane Republicans and getting things done. I'm not holding my breath, but I can hope. But the more of this that keeps coming, the more of these stories keep hitting us, the more we learn about the West Virginian guy who wanted to set up the meeting to meet with the Trump campaign and the Russians because of their shared Christian values. This kind of stuff is scary, and you got to wonder how much of this goes on a daily basis. Now, what's interesting to me is this West Virginia guy went through their senator there. That again, you go, how many people are involved? How much involvement is across the Republican Party? That this Rick Clay guy would have the kind of contacts to be able to reach out to Shelley Moore Capito and say, "Hey, can you pass a little note along to the Trump people? Can you do that for me? That the Russians want to meet." It's really kind of interesting. And yet here we are, talking about things that, we've talked about on this program for a long time. We've had guests on going, hey, there's this out there and there's this out there and there's all, Sater and Stone and Manafort and all of these figures who have ties here and ties there. It's something we've known for a long time. And yet here we are again in this moment where the facts are starting to pop up. And the investigation is going to get more in-depth. Because Mueller's investigation, you got to be looking at all of this stuff. You got to look at these ties. And I think it has to, I read an article just before coming on air that said, Democrats are in trouble too when it comes to the Russia issue. And as someone who views myself as a patriotic American, I don't care about party or political label when it comes to the kind of influence that has been going on. And I've been talking about this for a while. The kind of money that's been flowing in from the Russian oligarchs, this incestuous marriage between our wealth class and theirs, and the global elite, really, who are trying to subvert democracy here. And are spending, just untold. And I know, please, right-wingers, don't send me George Soros' name. Not a fan of George Soros. But there's one. The big money is all on the right. The billionaire money is all there because they know. They know when they have the kind of control that they're pushing for. They know that when they have the kind of just authoritarian rule that comes with that mindset, they're going to be able to cash in even more. As the old man always said, look, rich people understand return on investment. So when they take a buck out of their pocket to tell you you don't need something, you better spend two to get it. Because they understand that return on investment. They understand that buying a politician or buying a presidency is going to reap enormous returns. And you look at the tax scheme that they're talking about proposing. Trump's, going on this, well, we're going to close some loopholes. We're going to get rid of, things, that those hedge fund managers use. And you go, okay, but you're talking about lowering the top marginal rate from 39.6 down to 15%. You're talking about destroying those top rates to where the loopholes don't matter anymore because the loopholes actually were higher than what you're proposing. I mean, it's really mind-blowing. But yet we hear tax, and we've been trained as a society to anytime you hear the word tax come up, we kind of foam at the mouth like Pavlovian dogs without actually asking the next question, which is, okay, if we're going to cut taxes, for who? Who are we cutting taxes on? Am I going to see $1 in my wallet? Will we be able to pay for infrastructure, education? Go down the list of all the things that we need. FEMA. Are we going to be able to pay for these things? Well, not so much. Kind of makes you wonder. Kind of makes you wonder how these folks want to lead this country and where they're leading us. It wasn't all that long ago. In my lifetime, we were less than $1 trillion in debt. In my lifetime, we were on the path to being debt-free. In my lifetime, we had a strong middle class. In my lifetime, work paid. People who worked hard and played by the rules were able to get ahead. In my lifetime, people had defined benefit pensions, so they had security in retirement. In my lifetime, people had health insurance to where they got sick, they went to the doctor, and they were cared for without going bankrupt. Somehow, as we've moved to the privatized, corporatized, and profitized world that we now seem to fantasize is the best of all options, we now have people who have no health insurance. We have a government who wants to take from 20 million people health insurance that they were able to get through the Affordable Care Act. We now have policies that want to turn this country into a right-to-work nation, to where workers being able to fight for better wages, hours, and conditions are out the window. We have undone a good portion of, not just the last 40 years of progress, but the last 70 years of progress. And it's going to get worse. We're going to continue down this really negative path. And it's scary stuff. Frustrating and angering all at the same time. We couldn't get Andrea Chalupa on the line. Something going on probably in New York. Maybe the phone lines are down. Who knows? We'll take a quick break right back after this. Stick around. I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1907. That was the day that became known for the Quebec Bridge disaster in Canada. Workers were building a cantilever bridge over the St. Lawrence River. This was not an easy task. The river was 2 miles wide at its narrowest point. The river was deep, moved quickly, and was icy in the winter. But in the late 1880s, businessmen in Quebec who wanted to keep up trade with Montreal decided the river had to be spanned. The project did not begin for more than a decade due to a lack of funds. Finally, the Canadian government supported the project to improve the nation's railway infrastructure. Theodore Cooper, a respected American bridge designer, was signed on for the project. Despite concerns about the bridge's design, he never visited the site due to illness. 86 men were working on the project that fateful day. Their workday was drawing to a close when the bridge suddenly collapsed. 75 men plunged to their deaths. Some of their bodies were never found. The bridge collapsed because of design flaws. The official report of the disaster noted that the loss of life, quote, might have been prevented by the exercise of better judgment on the part of those in responsible charge of the work for the Quebec Bridge and Railway Company and the Phoenix Bridge Company. Unfortunately, it was not the last tragedy trying to cross the St. Lawrence. After the bridge collapsed, the Canadian government took over the project. A partial collapse on that effort killed 13 more workers in 1916. The bridge finally opened in 1917. Its completion came at a high price, costing $22 million and 86 lives. Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show. For more information, go to laborhistoryin2.com.
Chances are, when you took a shower this morning, an AFSCME member made sure that water was clean. When you drove to work, an AFSCME member maintained the road. When you rode an elevator, an AFSCME member inspected it. I'm David Philman, Executive Director of AFSCME Council 13, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. AFSCME members enforce regulations, keep prisoners behind bars, take care of patients, protect the environment, and more. The work isn't glamorous, the salaries aren't high, but AFSCME members serve the public in every aspect of our daily lives. Chances are, you'll never see that AFSCME member working in a sewage plant, diving underwater to repair a bridge, or answering a 911 call. But aren't you glad they do? For more information, visit AFSCME13.org. We are AFSCME. We make Pennsylvania happen!
Welcome back to the Rick Smith Show. Check out the website, thericksmithshow.com. I've been enjoying the right wing doing gymnastics around Sheriff Joe Arpaio and really showing who they are. They're trying to defend Trump's decision at every turn. They're trying to, to say, okay, we're in favor of it. In fact, Steve King was on CNN the other day, and he's stuck on this. Well, I don't think we should do away with racial profiling. And you go, well, wait a second. Because King said, I don't agree that profiling is wrong. In fact, he said, if you take away profiling away from the tools from law enforcement, you couldn't describe a criminal in any way whatsoever. And you go, but hold on. First, the most important point is Arpaio was not convicted of profiling or racial profiling or any of that. That wasn't the charge. He was convicted of not following a court order. Now you go, oh, that's splitting hairs. No, that's the rule of law. Look, if you want racial profiling to be put into place, Steve King, there's a process as a congressman to go through and pass a law that says we're going to racially profile. And you did. And the Supreme Court shot it down. So this isn't just about Arpaio racial profiling, and we agree with that, so we're defending racial profiling. No, this is about the rule of law. This is a much bigger, much more important issue. But I've been watching all of these, the Kings and the fake news people and all these people doing the gymnastics around, trying to whip up people, their base into a frenzy on the immigrant issue, and pointing the finger at them, those evil immigrants, and I struggle with people who lie. And again, he was not convicted of racial profiling. He was convicted of the crime of not following a court order, contempt of court. And you stop and you think about the President of the United States intervened in a rule of law kind of case on the wrong side again. And now what you've got is Arpaio running around thanking Alex Jones, the crazy insaniac, for him being pardoned. What does that say about this country? What does it say about us when someone who's off on the fringe like Alex Jones is, who's going to chase somebody down on the street because they said something wrong, and is that the kind of leadership that we want? And I look at it, it's pretty simple to me. He didn't follow the court's order. He is the chief law enforcement agent of that county. If he doesn't follow the law that he's supposed to enforce, how is he going to enforce it? If we don't hold law enforcement to a standard, what does that say? What message does that give to the rest of society? And I've just been amazed at how insane the right has become. I was reading an article earlier of, a guy had asked the question, how is it that, all of these Trump supporters still view Trump in a positive light? How is it these people are still on board with this kind of messaging, and the Nazis and the Putin stuff and this? How are they stupid? Are they insane? Are they evil? And he finally came away with going, look, these are people like me who are angry. These are people who want change in Washington. They want things to work. They want to have opportunities. They want the inequality gap to close. They want better wages. They want better working conditions. They want better opportunities. They want better schools, safer neighborhoods. They want all this stuff, and it's not happening. And everyone along the governing bodies, are paying them lip service, but still nothing's getting done. For my entire lifetime, we've been hearing about, we're going to create good jobs, we're going to do all this stuff, and yet campaign promise after campaign promise doesn't happen. And this guy, the same thing. I mean, Trump, the exact same. He's a politician like the rest of them. Now we're going to lock her up. Mexico's going to pay for the wall. Nonsense. So I look at, where we are currently, and I look at this kind of weird, bizarre world of anger. And how do we move that anger in a constructive path? And I've been saying for a very long time, this is an opportunity for labor to step in and say, look, your jobs suck. How do we make them better? How do we make conditions better for everyone? How do we raise that boat? How do we, grow the middle class? How do we make sure that people have opportunities, their kids get to go to college? These are the discussions that we should be having. How do we deal with the tsunami of job losses that we know are coming in the next 5, 10, 20 years? How are we going to deal with that? There's absolutely no policy discussions going on right now about the fact that, 4 years ago, a study came out and said that half of all jobs that are currently done 4 years ago are going to be gone in 20 years. That means we're only 16 years away from that prediction. And yet there's no policy moving us. All we hear from the right is this idiotic belief, wow, we just got to get more education. Okay, where are the mechanisms to do that? Well, we're setting up the private sector. We're going to have the free market come in and bring us for-profit colleges, of which we see time and time again failing, which we see time and time again screwing students over. We see time and time again of predatory practices and manipulation and just downright theft. And then a government who goes, oh, oops, sorry. We'll make a settlement. And you get pennies on the dollar. And the criminals, they walk off. We're having no substantive discussion about what the future of this country looks like because we're mired in this nonsense that we're going to go back to the 1950s. Well, let me let you in a little secret. Ain't happening. I would love to go back to the 1950s and 60s where a third of the workforce was unionized, where we had one-income families. And a good one-income families where people could keep up with the Joneses, take a vacation, send the kids to college, where there was shared prosperities, where CEOs and worker bees all lived in similar communities, at least in the same state. And it just makes you wonder. It makes you wonder at which point do we finally wake up? And do the 36% of us who still support this president wake up to the reality that it ain't getting any better? The policies, the poison that they're pushing will only make things worse. And maybe, going back to my conversation with Chris Stroop, maybe that's the point. Maybe the point is to make us desperate. Maybe the point is to make us pliable. Maybe the point is to make us give up on the idea of self-governance and self-rule and the representative democracy in favor of being what some in this country have always wanted, a fascist state. A Putin-like dictator. Kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? Kind of makes you angry, doesn't it? Kind of makes you frustrated, doesn't it? So what are we going to do about it? How do we respond? How do we fix it? That's the question. We'll take a quick break. Right back after this. Stick around. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show. We're working people.
90% of the wealth, 10% of the people own 90% of the wealth. Where do you fit in? Take a look at yourself. 10% of the people own 90% of the wealth.
Where smart policy and sound investment matters. The Rick Smith Show.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1996. That was the day the workers at the Lusty Lady Strip Club in San Francisco made their final push to make their case for the right to join a union. They made history by winning the union vote 57-15. SEIU Local 790 led the historic campaign. What started the union drive was the windows at the private booths where the ladies performed. The windows had one-way glass. That meant patrons could look in, but performers could not see out. They worried that the men could videotape them or take photographs without their permission. When management refused to change the windows, the women started talking union. Soon, other workplace issues arose as the women furthered their union discussion. One woman recalled, "We started to discuss other problems at work, like being forced to come in when you were sick." She went on, "Our first thought was to organize a petition, but we were really concerned about individual dancers being scapegoated and fired because that happened on a regular basis." Another participant in the union drew on her personal background as a reason for getting involved. She noted, "I had been raised to support union efforts and the workers' cause. I hadn't ever worked at a place where there was any sort of struggle to be a part of." The women ran a successful campaign to unionize. Despite winning the vote, management dragged its feet in negotiating their first contract. The women went on strike, and management locked them out. Few men dared to cross the picket line to enter the club, and within a few days, management capitulated and returned to the bargaining table where the women signed their first contract. Labor History in 2 brought to you by the Illinois Labor History Society and The Rick Smith Show. For more information, go to laborhistoryin2.com, like us on Facebook, and follow us on the Twitters at Labor History in 2.
While our present president's moral character seems stuck somewhere between boorish and brutish, it's only fair to note that he also has an aesthetic dimension. This surprising side of Trump popped out several days after the Charlottesville attacks by raging white supremacists. In a presidential tweet, he said, "Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart." Yes, very sad to see a resurfacing of raw bigotry ripping so viciously into America's historic attempts to create a culture of mutual respect and unity in a nation of extraordinary diversity. E pluribus unum, as our national maxim puts it. Oh, wait, that's not what Donald meant. Rather than criticizing those who are out to rip apart the American culture's big idea of egalitarianism, this was just more babble from the boorish Trump. He was actually advocating the continued presence of statues of Confederate champions of racism, pieces of bronze and granite that publicly celebrate America's shameful period of slavery, secession, and white supremacy. The KKK thugs invaded Charlottesville in violent objection to the city's planned removal of a statue of Robert E. Lee, who led the Southern States War against the USA so they could keep enslaving African Americans. Trump's lament, then, was not about the attack on America's humanitarian ideals, but merely about, quote, the removal of our beautiful statues. Apparently it never occurred to him that most Americans do not consider those statues either beautiful or ours. Ironically, Robert E. Lee himself opposed erecting Confederate statues across the South. Quote, "I think it wiser not to keep open the sores of war," he said, "but instead to obliterate the marks of civil strife." This is Jim Hightower saying, we could use a leader with such wisdom today when bigots feel newly empowered to incite civil strife across our nation.
Hightower's commentaries are brought to you by the Hightower Lowdown, the monthly newsletter with Hightower's take on what Wall Street and Washington are up to. For information, visit hightowerlowdown.org.
Bringing sanity and rational thought back to America. Rick Smith.
To be honest with you, I'm amazed while the rain is still falling in Texas. You've got Heck of a Job Brownie on CNBC, basically calling for a privatization of the National Flood Insurance Program, a program, honestly, that they didn't want to begin with because it's not profitable and the risks too great. And again, we've done this as a country in a lot of areas where the risk is too great for the insurance industry to profit off of. We've taken it and we've done it because, look, it has to be done. And if we, the people, are not going to do it, then what kind of a country are we going to be when these crises hit? Here to talk a little bit about the big flood, what's going on in Texas, and really the media coverage of it, the alternative reality that we see over at Fake News. I've got Craig Harrington from Media Matters for America. He's the Economic Policy Program Director there. Craig, thanks for taking time for us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me again.
So, I look at this call to privatize this insurance program, and are you surprised this soon?
I'm honestly not surprised. I've spoken about this with a couple of people previously, but whenever there is, for example, a mass shooting or a shooting incident that gets a specific amount of notoriety or publicity in national media, liberals, progressives, Democrats are attacked by conservatives for supposedly polarizing the issue and politicizing the issue when they bring up potentially gun safety reforms that would prevent future shootings. Because there's a reason to bring up a policy issue that you care about in proximity to something that directly affects that policy issue. So in this case, what you have is a neoconservative, Mike Brown, one of these free market Ayn Randian types of people, who sees flood insurance is suddenly in the news and thinks this is an opportunity to make money for private business. Of course, when you're talking about gun safety regulations, that's something that actually helps millions of people. When you're talking about potentially privatizing the National Flood Insurance Program, that's something that helps investors, and it helps the Wall Street financiers who form the core of the Republican Party's donor base. But it doesn't actually help the individuals who receive flood insurance. Making it private doesn't actually help the recipients of the program. It will probably result in higher costs and less access for individuals who live in flood-prone areas that are increasingly flood-prone thanks to climate change and sea level rise. So I'm not surprised that it happened, but the logic behind it is just so perverse because this is an opportunity. National Flood Insurance Program is in debt, and it's about to be totally swamped by claims in the wake of Hurricane Harvey. We still have three more months of Atlantic hurricane season to weather. And what conservatives want to do is take this opportunity to dramatize the flood insurance program, talk about how it's on its last legs so that they can turn this multi-billion-dollar federal program into a multi-billion-dollar public-private partnership that creates an intermediary in the private sector that will leach out profit in the same way that private health insurance exists. So it's actually a perfect opportunity for them. It was interesting to see the interview on CNBC. Kelly Evans, the co-host of Squawk Box, actually pushed back on Mike Brown and said, look, when a big storm hits a place like Houston, don't we just all have to realize that we are going to bite the bullet and we're going to pay for the rebuilding? And he goes, no. What we're going to do is privatize it, and people who can't afford private insurance are going to have to move, or they're going to have to lose what they lost in the flood. I think that the attempt backfired, but it's not a surprise.
Yeah, but again, it goes back to that conservative mindset. And you hear these kind of simplistic arguments. Well, they shouldn't have built there in the first place, Craig, because if they knew it was going to flood, they shouldn't have built there.
Yeah, and so there are lots of problems with the National Flood Insurance Program. The biggest critique that you'll see from even proponents of the program is that in order to get the full amount of coverage, you have to rebuild in the same place, the same place that was just inundated by a flood. So the only way you can get the full value of your insurance payout is to rebuild right there in the wake of the next flood. So obviously there are problems with that. But in the case of Houston, it's being hit with a 500-year flood. This happens to be the third consecutive year when the city of Houston has been inundated by 500-year floods because some factor is causing sea levels to rise and is supercharging storms and is putting more moisture in the atmosphere. Some sort of change is happening to the climate. Nobody really knows why, though, if you ask the conservatives.
Well, God's angry at us, Craig.
But, the people who are being flooded in Houston are not building in areas that are typically prone to this specific type of disaster. No one would build in a place that was under 6 feet of water. You couldn't live there. Houston isn't supposed to be flooded like this. The whole reason that this flood is happening is because you have a confluence of supercharged storms, increased moisture in the atmosphere, several inches of sea level rise along the Gulf Coast that have resulted in this storm bringing more water, higher storm surges, more rain. And at the same time, you have reductions in federal spending on infrastructure to prevent these sorts of disasters, a reduction in state-level funding to prevent these disasters. You know, this is a city, Houston, that is relying on a flood control system. These reservoirs that just began spilling over the tops in the past hour and a half. These reservoirs were built in 1938. All of our infrastructure in this country is a legacy from a bygone era, and it is not up to the standards that we need for the 21st century with or without climate change. So something like Houston, you know, this isn't supposed to happen. And the reason that it's been so devastating, the reason that the devastation will continue, is because we haven't made the proper investments in the past to prepare ourselves for these types of disasters. And unfortunately, if people like Mike Brown succeed in privatizing the National Flood Insurance Program, or if climate change deniers like President Trump succeed in refusing to upgrade our infrastructure with climate change in mind, these disasters are only going to get more costly because all of our big cities are on coasts. All of our big economic assets are on coastlines in flood-prone areas because that's where humans have just always built settlements. Places like Houston, places like Miami, places like New York City are going to get hit by more and more storms, and we can either address that or we can just continue to reap these devastating costs. Unfortunately, I think so long as the Republicans are in control of Congress and the presidency, we're just going to sit here and have to face the brunt of it.
Yeah, well, again, you go back to, I'll steal Naomi Klein's statement of disaster capitalism. This works well for them because, look, there's going to be tons of taxpayer dollars that are going to be flowing in through, as you've said, these public-private partnerships and rebuilding, and now the push for the insurance, to where we now have these public-private partnerships where it's a whole ton of public money going to private entities to hand over our stuff.
Yeah, and actually there's a perfect analog for what we may be facing in terms of the long-term growing accumulated costs of these supercharged storms that are the result of climate change, sea level rise, global warming, et cetera. And the analog is the financial crisis. The bad debts, right, could be seen as sort of building in a flood zone. The bad debts didn't cause the crisis. The crisis was caused when those debts when those debts got called in, and all the products that were built off of those debts began to tumble, and all of the insurance products that were meant to guarantee those secondary products against losses began to crumble. You know, the biggest payout during the financial crisis wasn't to a bank, it wasn't to an investment company, it was to AIG, which was a company that insured the investment banks. And it was the one that had the biggest losses during the financial crisis. The insurers are the ones that are going to be paying out gigantic sums of money when the next storm hits Houston, when the next storm hits San Antonio, when the next storm hits Miami, New York City, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia. These cities that are going to become inundated increasingly with floods, they're going to be representing gigantic insurance losses, and eventually the private insurers aren't going to be able to pay those debts, and the public is going to be on the hook for them exactly the way we were during the financial crisis, unless we do something to mitigate it, which is going to require not only addressing carbon pollution and not only addressing the factors that cause climate change and drive climate change, but we're also going to have to invest billions, probably trillions of long-term dollars in rebuilding our coastal infrastructure to mitigate sea level rise and to address the built-in several feet of sea level rise that we're going to see over the next century. We're not doing any of the economic preparation for this climate catastrophe, and that is going to lead to financial downfall in the long term, and the American taxpayer are going to be on the hook for it. But we can see it coming just like we saw the financial crisis coming, and unfortunately we are still unprepared for it.
Yeah, I mean, again, when we think of climate change and we think of all the negative effects, we're always led to, the developing world and, the countries who are on the margin. Not a lot of people talking about what's going to happen to us when New York's underwater or Miami or now Texas.
Yeah, and speaking of New York being underwater and now Texas, Texas Senator Ted Cruz was one of 36 Republicans in 2013 who refused to vote in favor of the Sandy relief bill because they thought that it was a handout to Democratic politicians and to Democratic areas. If you're a Republican member of Congress from Texas, there's no necessary direct benefit in you spending tax dollars rebuilding New York City. But New York City is the most valuable economic asset in the country. It had to be rebuilt. Infrastructure improvements had to be made. And now the same people who refused to rebuild on the Atlantic seaboard are now demanding a blank check of federal money to rebuild on the Gulf Coast. And of course they deserve it. We have to rebuild Houston. But the cognitive dissonance is absurd. I don't expect any Democrats to refuse to fund rebuilding efforts in Houston, unless, of course, Trump tries to attach funding for his border wall into the rebuilding efforts to address Hurricane Harvey. But the Republicans and their co-conspirators and enablers in conservative media really did try to strip Sandy relief effort in 2013 and try to reduce the amount the federal government was able to rebuild infrastructure in the wake of that storm. It's probably not going to happen this time because Democrats don't get the same benefit out of it with their voters as Republicans got from their voters. But that is something that we saw in just a few years ago. And if Democrats find themselves in power again, which will, maybe one day happen again, there will certainly be more storms. And the question is, are conservative media and the Republican Party that's affiliated with it going to try to stand in the way and prevent the kind of investments that we need to rebuild in the wake of the next storm in, say, 2023? The question is always out there. We rebuilt after Katrina. There was a huge fight over rebuilding after Sandy. We'll rebuild after Houston. The question is, what are we going to do for the next storm and the next storm and the next storm? Because they will keep coming.
Yeah, and these storms aren't going to get it. From what I'm reading from scientists and people who have been studying this stuff, these storms are not going to get any smaller or less dangerous. And you're right, we're just not doing it. But here's the thing: I hope there are no Democrats who oppose this. But do you really think Trump would be petulant, childish enough to attach his border wall money to this? I mean, and if he does, do you think the base finally wakes up?
I mean, it's not entirely out of the question. He was asked a question during a press conference yesterday about whether or not his threats to shut down the federal government would affect the Federal Emergency Management Agency's administrative efforts to rebuild and respond to the ongoing crisis for Hurricane Harvey. And he falsely claimed that a government shutdown would not affect FEMA and the agencies that are directly responsible for the cleanup and the rebuilding efforts. That's not true. If we do shut down the government,
everything
it will impact the Harvey relief efforts. And the reason the government is being threatened with a shutdown is because Donald Trump wants funding for his border wall. And so the idea that he might threaten to add border wall money into a Harvey relief bill is not out of the question at all, particularly because Texas is our state with the largest border with Mexico. It's also our state with the largest and most powerful Republican political contingent, and many of them, actually want that wall money. So it's entirely possible that we'll have some kind of fight in Congress where congressional Republicans and many of their allies in the right-wing media are promoting this idea that Harvey relief might have to be tied in with a border wall. But the people who want the wall, they're not going to be opposed to that. The base isn't going to sort of wake up one day and realize that Donald Trump is willing to strong-arm his way into building this wall at their own expense. They already don't care that he promised that Mexico would pay for it, and now they're paying for it. I doubt that they would mind that he was using any kind of nefarious wrangling tactic to get the legislation through.
Yeah, well, like they say, never let a good crisis go to waste, right?
Absolutely.
Scary, scary stuff. Craig, I appreciate your thoughts and keeping us up to date. I appreciate it, man.
Thank you.
Great talking with you. Craig Harrington, Media Matters for America. You can check out their website. We'll get a link at thericksmithshow.com. Quick break. Right back. Stick around. You're listening to The Rick Smith Show. We're working people from the top.
The Rick Smith Show.
I'm Rick Smith, and this is Labor History in 2. On this day in labor history, the year was 1941. That's the day 2,500 steel workers at the Pressed Steel Car Company near McKees Rock, Pennsylvania, walked off the job. It was the second walkout in 2 weeks. Workers effectively shut down production of armor plate for the Navy, shell forgings for the Army, and railroad cars used to transport military material. The company had gone back on promises of holding a collective bargaining election. Steelworkers Organizing Committee Sub-Regional Director Abe Martin told the Pittsburgh Press that while the union had not called the strike, workers had, quote, walked out themselves because they are fed up with the company's discrimination against them. SWAC had been trying to organize the plant for years, but the company had engineered an election for a so-called independent union 18 months earlier when the complex was only operating at half capacity. Workers walked out at the beginning of the month and ended their strike on the guarantee that negotiations for a new election would begin. But when they returned, they found that some were stripped of their seniority while others were forcefully transferred to new departments. The day before, machine shop workers on the afternoon shift were fed up and dropped their tools. Word spread throughout the evening, and by early morning, picket lines were solid and production had come to a complete standstill. When the company tried to force reopening of the plant after Labor Day, 1,500 workers formed picket lines at the gate to stop scabbing. They returned to work 10 days later in compliance with a request by the National Defense Mediation Board. The NLRB rejected SWAC's election petition 2 months later, but SWAC persisted and won exclusive bargaining rights the following June.
From New York, this is your World in 2 Minutes. I'm your host, Luke Vargas, for Talk Media News. New U.S. sanctions targeting Venezuela and its national oil producer have gone into effect. Signed on Friday, the sanctions bar Americans from purchasing debt from the Venezuelan government or the state oil firm Petróleos de Venezuela. In an executive order, President Trump said the sanctions are in response to serious abuses of human rights and fundamental freedoms in Venezuela. He called a new parliament formed by President Nicolas Maduro earlier this month illegitimate and part of a broader push by Maduro to limit democracy in Venezuela. But one major Venezuelan asset left untouched by the sanctions is Citgo, the U.S.-based oil giant owned by the Venezuelan government. In a statement released by the White House, transactions only involving Citgo are exempt from the sanctions as a way to, quote, mitigate harm to the American and Venezuelan people. In the first 6 months of 2017, Citgo has spent some $900,000 lobbying the U.S. government, including a new lobbying contract launched in April to stop the Trump administration from including Citgo in sanctions on Venezuela. It appears that money was money well spent. And the U.S., Canada, and Mexico will meet on Friday for a second round of NAFTA renegotiation talks after a first round of talks ended earlier this month relatively amicably. But a series of tweets from President Trump over the weekend have injected politics back into the negotiations. On Sunday, Trump blamed Mexico for a high crime rate and repeated a campaign promise that Mexico would have to pay for a proposed border wall through, quote, reimbursement/other. He went on to say that if the renegotiations don't go well, the U.S. may be forced to terminate the deal altogether. Mexico's foreign ministry responded to Trump, saying that under no circumstances would the country fund the border wall, and noting that U.S. drug demand is fueling violence south of the border. For more global news headlines, visit TalkMediaNews.com.
Making the blue blood see red. The Rick Smith Show.
RickSmithShow.com. Questions, comments, something on your mind. You can email me, Rick, at TheRickSmithShow.com. Again, I go back to that privatization thing. Look, I think Craig's right. They never let a good crisis go to waste. This is a perfect opportunity for them to float the idea of, hey, we won't have to pay for it. Let those people pay for it for themselves. And look, I agree. There are some problems with the program. But you don't scrap it. You don't hand it over to the people who, one, didn't do it before. And again, I go back to that. The same thing with, well, let the churches do it. Well, did they before? No. Are they now? No. Then why would we advocate for something that they're not doing? It's nuts. Just crazy. More good news. The president, again, in the assault on President Obama's legacy, Trump has gone after the ban on police departments getting military armaments. And you may remember, the President Obama stopped giving police departments, armored vehicles, grenade launchers, that stuff. Because, during a traffic stop, you need nothing more than a grenade launcher to make sure Granny gives you her ID. So President Obama said, we're going to stop this. Police departments should not be military mindset. Like I live in a very small community where the policemen, they look like they just fell out of Afghanistan. They've got the combat, uniforms on with the baggy pants. They look like paratroopers. With the leg strap, with the, the holster with the thigh strap and the waist, holster. They look like they just came. They're ready for war. President Obama said maybe we should move back from that. Well, what Trump has now done is, I guess we're undoing that. We're going to make military police departments great again. And maybe we'll start seeing tanks rolling down the center of small towns all across the country. Because I found out the little town that I live in has a freaking tank. I'm going, what possible purpose could you use a tank? Well, meth labs. Okay, you're going to drive over the meth lab with the tank? And speaking of driving over, there's at least 6 states across the country who are pursuing pieces of legislation somewhere in the path of, I guess, making it legal to run over protesters and kill them. I guess this is the direction we're now going. You've got a lot of Republican states who are angry at these people, walking out on the highways and shutting down traffic. And I'll be honest with you, I think it's a stupid tactic. I know I'm going to take a lot of flack for that, but I think you're just ticking people off. But to say that we're going to pass a piece of legislation that if you happen to run one of them over and kill them, you're not going to be held liable, sets up another stand your ground type scenario where we're going to have these yahoos out there running people over on purpose saying, oh, gee, it was an accident. Again, more bad ideas. And who's it coming from? Guess. I mean, do I actually have to say it? The same people who brought you the stand your ground laws. When I was a kid, you start a fight with somebody and they kicked your behind. My mother would have said, you got what you deserved. Now, thanks to a bunch of lunch money victims who are running the Republican Party, now it's okay to start a fight with somebody. They begin to kick your behind and you shoot them. I guess this is where we're going as a country. And I'll be honest, I'm not thrilled. I am not thrilled with where we're heading under this leadership. Which again is why I keep saying we need to continue the organizing that I see going on every day. We need to continue to get off the couch and turn off the reality shows on TV and tune into the reality show that is the White House and our government. And begin to run for office, hold people accountable, move in the right direction, take us back to sanity. This is not where we're heading, is not where I want my kids growing up. This kind of authoritarian rule, this kind of this angry bravado, this kind of hooray for me and the hell with everybody else that we see all across the spectrum. And fake news is, right there with it. And it blows my mind that there would be a woman in this country that would side with that. I mean, it's really kind of interesting. They want to take us back to the old days. And as a white male, wouldn't be bad for me. But I don't want that for my kids. I don't want it for my daughters. And definitely don't want it for the future of our nation. We've made too much progress to go so far back. Anyway, if you've missed any of today's program, thericksmithshow.com. That's where you get the podcast, the Rick Smith Show app on the smartphone. Take the program on the go wherever you go. And as always, you can email me, rick@thericksmithshow.com. Check out our YouTube video. We've also got it there at thericksmithshow.com. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll be back here. We'll be back here tomorrow.
listening to The Rick Smith Show. Together, we can make America better. Email rick@thericksmithshow.com or interact with us anytime at thericksmithshow.com. Until next time, this has been The Rick Smith Show, where working people come to talk.
Its color like the tidal flood beneath the lunar sway, imperial, mysterious in